As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Values are really at the core of your career choices. And for an easy example is if you are eco-friendly, you're not going to take a job at a company that's been cited for pollution, right? And some people would say like, well, I'm just an accountant there. And they can kind of rationalize it for a year or two. But I always tell people that eventually that will catch up with you because the misalignment of the values is just so important that it will cause you to have stomach aches before you go to work. And usually when someone's really unhappy at a job, it usually is some value conflict, whether it's your values and the company's values or your values and your boss's values or the culture of the organization.
That was Paula Brand on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are four experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
I'm here with Debbie to introduce today's episode where I have a conversation with Paula Brand, who is a career coach, and we talk all about making decisions around career changes and pivots. And she really walks us through some great ideas for how to identify some of the important factors to consider if you're thinking about making a job change. So Debbie, what was your reaction to this episode?
Well, I really liked it. I end up talking to people a lot about work in my clinical practice. And over the years, this is something I've developed an interest in. And I think that a lot of times people are grappling with something really hard if they want to make a big change in their life, or whether it's changing a job into a different setting or a specific job or a major career change. And I think a lot of times people can feel a little bit lost with that. There's so many different options out there. Most jobs and most careers have some pros and some cons. And, you're trying to sort through all of this. And what do I really care about? What would make me happier and more satisfied in my life? And I'll often recommend that someone do some soul searching around this and to think about some of the possibilities out there. But that feels really daunting. And so I think what I love about this conversation is she gives you some really clear and specific things to think about to guide your, soul searching and your thought process around this so that you find a good fit. You may decide to change careers. You may decide, actually, I'm in a pretty good place right now. But either way, I think this is interesting to grapple with this. And even for myself, I'm not thinking about a career change at this moment in my life. As she was talking, I noticed myself having reactions to certain things she was saying. Like she was talking about highly organized people doing detail-oriented work. Like in accounting or something like that and thinking to myself, like, oh, that sounds like a really bad fit for me personally. That's like my worst nightmare because I'm so not detail oriented at all. So even just noticing that reaction, you're learning a little bit of something about yourself in that. And so it was kind of cool to hear how a career coach talks to people about this kind of thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you and I were talking, I think yesterday, sometime within the last couple of days, where I was feeling a little nervous. Like, was this topic even appropriate for POTC? Like, it's about career. Is it related enough to psychology? And what you and I both agreed is we see a lot of people in our practice, like we spend so much time at work, and a lot of our quality of life is impacted by our careers. And I too see people in my practice who, they come for anxiety-based reasons. And then often, what's at the root of the stress or the anxiety is having a lot of struggles at work, knowing that something needs to change, but having absolutely no idea. Just like, I know I'm miserable, but I have no idea what to do, and needing some help, feeling totally overwhelmed, and then needing some help for like, I need a place to start in terms of even thinking through how to make this decision. And, you and I have been in psychology our entire careers, and I have no desire or intention to change my career, but I've pivoted a lot in terms of the hats that I've worn, from being a therapist to being a professor to being a podcaster, right? And a book author, and now doing a lot of public speaking. And, I realized that what has helped me be able to make those pivots has been doing an inventory of like, well, what am I good at? And what am I interested in? And what do I care about? And the opposite, where am I getting burnt out? She and I didn't really talk about burnout specifically, but, what is no longer serving me? And that has really helped. And so I loved this book. I loved this conversation because she gives people a really structured and useful way to think through, like you're saying, to think through some of those factors. Yeah.
I think the biggest pivot I did was in grad school because I started out on the academic track. That was my program when I started.
Like so many of us did.
I didn't,
yeah.
I didn't love it. And I had all these other things I was doing all on the side. And I remember going to the Office of Career Services and looking at all these different options, taking some of the assessments that she talks about in this conversation, looking in things that had nothing to do with psychology, like consulting and all these other fields that they tell you about in career services, and ultimately coming to the decision to switch into clinical work. And I couldn't be happier that I did. And that wasn't a huge, it was still within psychology, and I was still pretty early in my career. So it wasn't a huge career change, but it was a pivot for sure. And I had a lot of mixed feelings about it. And I do feel so glad I went through that process because I learned a lot about myself and came out the other side in a place where I love my career. And I mean, I don't love it every second of the day, of course. But for the most part, I'm really satisfied. And I think I found a good fit. And I don't think I would have felt that way if I hadn't gone through, a lot of grappling about that.
Definitely. I taught this class called Professional Development to psychology graduate students, and I would have mental health professionals in the community come talk about the different areas they worked in, forensics or hospitals, because you can do a lot of different things in our field. And what ended up happening unintentionally is they all told their story about where they started and the path they took and where they ended up. And these were the most meandering paths you've ever seen. And what the students ended up saying in their feedback that was the most helpful, that helped them to just exhale, was, oh, you mean I don't need to know right this second exactly what I'm going to be doing for the next 50 years?
Right.
It gave them this permission to just do your best to decide what it is you think you want to do right now. And then as you continue to evaluate what's important to you and what your interests are and what you're good at, because you acquire skills over time, right? You can pivot and pivot again and pivot again. And, and what Paula does is she gives you this roadmap for how to make those decisions. But, I think that hopefully can be helpful for listeners to hear, is that many, many successful people are not on linear career paths, and it's never too late to make a change. And hopefully this episode will offer a way forward for those who are really feeling like they would like to do that. So we hope you enjoy this episode with Paula Brand. Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I'm really excited about my guest today, who is Paula Brand, the founder of Brand Career Management. Paula Brand is a global career coach and consultant, LinkedIn expert, speaker, trainer, and author with a background in human resources, workforce development, training, and career counseling. She speaks to groups and provides individual career coaching on using LinkedIn effectively, managing a successful career, and navigating through career transitions with a focus on empowering mid-career to executive women to achieve career satisfaction. Organizational clients have included the World Bank Group, the Caribbean Development Bank, and the Executive Educations programs at Johns Hopkins University. Paula released her first book in November 2022 on navigating career transitions titled The Purple Parachute, A Woman's Guide to Navigating the Winds of Career Change. And that is what she is here to talk to us about today. So Paula, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Thank you so much for having me, Jill. It's quite an honor, and I'm a total fan of Psychologists Off the Clock. So
awesome.
It's exciting.
Well, and I love that your bio is rich with all of the ways in which you are an expert at navigating LinkedIn, because I think, is that how we connected, was on LinkedIn, or did you find me some other way and then the LinkedIn came after that?
I found you through, I think, a post on social media about imposter phenomenon. And you commented on one of my comments, and then it got me leading to your book, and then I read your book, and then I found the podcast. So in the past 2 years, I've been a Jill Stoddard geek. So, but
I think one of the things that's really cool. Yeah. And I knew it was like somehow social media connected. And, I feel like a lot of us have a love-hate relationship with social media, and we often need to use social media for our careers. Like LinkedIn is a good example. And so, it's nice to see when social media connects people in a positive way, because you've been really supportive of my book, which I appreciate so much. And now here you are to talk about your book on Psychologists Off the Clock. So it's just a nice example of the good side of social media.
I agree. And you're right. It was LinkedIn was where the comment was. And I agree. I do have a love-hate relationship with social media as well. It's a necessary evil.
I think we all do. A necessary evil, for sure. Well, so today's episode, I think, is really for anyone who might be thinking about making a job or career change, but is, maybe feeling a little stuck in terms of next steps. When I read your book, I just thought, this is so great. Like, even if you aren't thinking about making a career change, but you're just sort of like dissatisfied or unhappy, I think it can be really helpful to people who want to do something different, or who even want to figure out how to make some changes in the job, or certainly the career that they're currently in. And what was so great about this book is that it really walks you through a step-by-step process. And so for me, I actually have some new goals for the next phase of my career for this 2024 year. And there are all these great prompts in the book. And I completed them all. A lot of people read books like this, like self-help books, things, and they're like, oh, I can skip that. Oh, I don't need to do that. And you really need to do it, especially in this book. And they were so helpful. And I feel like I gained so much clarity. And what I was hoping is, we don't have time to go through all of the things. People have to buy the book for that. But I thought we could walk our listeners at least through some of it. And I really like the way the book was structured too. So you structure it around what you call the ASTER model. And if people were able to see you right now, they would see that you have a big, pretty poster board behind you that says the ASTER career model. And that same diagram is in the book as well. So can you explain what the ASTER stands for, what each of those letters mean?
Definitely. So, thank you, first of all, for reading the book. And I'm so glad that you got so much out of it. I have to admit that I have read your book and I have not done all the exercises, but I have done some of them. And your book was the first book that I read that was not a hardcover book ever. And I don't think I'm going to go back to that. And this is part of the reason, is because I find it hard to go back to the exercises, because it's not like a book I can take with me somewhere. So anyway,
because it was like Kindle, or it was audio or something like that.
It's on a Remarkable, which I've been using for journaling, but never read a book on it. And
okay.
so I think I've decided, I tried it and I decided I definitely don't like it. But I will go back to them 100% because the ones that I did were very useful. Going back to the ASTER model and answering your question, the A stands for assess. And I'll delve into that a little deeper because there's a lot to that A. But just to go through the whole ASTER model quickly, S is for seek out, T is for test, E is for execute, and R is for repeat. And I can talk a little bit more detail about each one. Would you like me to do that?
Yeah, why don't you give like a brief definition of what they each mean, and then I'm going to ask you some specific questions within kind of each of those categories.
So,
okay.
A in the ASTER model stands for assess, and that's really taking stock of yourself, which before you make any major career decision, you should really do. And that involves what's important to you, what are your interests, what's your personality type, what are your superpowers, and of course, your skill sets. So that's what what I encourage you to go through in the assess phase and figure out what the answers to all of those questions are. And then S stands for seeking out information. And that involves research. Mostly it could be in books, it could be online, but really the most important part of S is informational interviews where you talk to other people who do the job. Okay. T is for test. And that's because you can test out some jobs. Not all jobs are testable, but there's many ways to test a job through volunteering, through internships, through midternships, returnships. There's a lot of ship words, a lot of boats you can take to get to that. But some sort of experiential learning of what the job will actually be like. Then execute covers a lot. So execute, when you get to the execute phase, you're probably either deciding you want a job, or you want to start a business, or you want to develop in place, which would be staying at your current job, but something changes. And so chapter 10, I believe, goes through execution and what those are. And then 11 is on job search, which is very specific on execution because that gets into interviews and resumes, things like that. And then R is for repeat because all of us are going to go through multiple career transitions in our lives. And that's just a fact. There's no more working for one company 30, 40 years. So the repeat is in there because that's a real phase. And you'll go through this phase or this model multiple times in your life.
Right. And our interests and our skill sets, like those things also change over time, right? People learn on the job. So the skills they have, when they go to repeat, when you assess a second time, some of those like interests and skills and superpowers may be different than they were the first time you went through this model.
Very much so. The skills, you can burn out on skills, you can learn new skills. Like you said, skills are probably the most malleable. I would say people's personalities don't change that dramatically usually. And values also usually don't change dramatically in a lifetime unless some major thing happens in your life to sort of promote or provoke those changes. But yeah, skills can totally change. Superpowers can change. Yeah. Interests can change.
Yeah. Okay. So test, execute, and repeat, the last three of the ASTER model, these come after a lot of reflection has occurred. So I thought we could focus a good part of our conversation today on the assess and seek out steps. So starting with that assess, with the assessment, or really just learning more about yourself. And, I imagine the reason we want to learn more about ourselves is so we don't like keep on just taking any job and then realizing it was a bad fit, right? Like we really want to focus on finding something that is truly a good fit. We spend so much time in our lives working. We want to be pleased with the work that we're doing. And so you have another great acronym for assessing, which is your VINES acronym. And VINES stands for values, interests, natural disposition, exceptional qualities, and skills. So let's start with values, which we talk a ton about on the podcast. And sometimes people mean different things about values. I think there's lots of different ways to look at values. So what do you mean by values? And why is this important to this assessment phase of career change?
Well, values, just as you talk about in the show, are really important to align with all things in your life, especially your career. And that can show up in different ways. I think it's helpful to first look at your general values like love, education, things like that. But really, that's a preliminary step to breaking it down to your work values, because the types of things you would see in work values would be, I would like to be recognized for my work. I would like work-life balance. I want to make an impact on the world. I want to make the most money possible. Those are all really specific to work, but they're values. Mm-hmm. They usually stem off of life values, but you want to find jobs that match your values, industries that match your values, employers that match your values, so that things are aligned.
Okay. And so is there, like I said, there's lots of different exercises in the book that we're not going to go through all of that in the interview, but what is one way that you like to help people start getting clear about their values when it comes to career change?
Well, when I'm working with a client one-on-one or in a group, I usually start with something called the No-Del Values Card Sort, which is, there's an online version and a tactile in-person version. So that's something I often use, and anyone could access that, but it does cost money if you just go to their website independently. On my website, I do have a free work values inventory, which anyone can access by going to my website. And on the homepage, you scroll down till you see that work values inventory. So those are...
Oh, that's awesome. And what we always ask this at the end, but for anyone who's like listening and saying, well, what's your website? What is your website? If people want to find that, we'll of course put it in the show notes.
Sure. The easiest is www.paulabrand.com, which is my name.
Okay.
Great. They can also, yes, we'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
Brandcareermanagement.com also goes to the same place, but to keep it simple.
It's such a great last name when you're in the business that you're in.
Oh,
right?
Many people have asked me if it's a real name.
Yeah.
It's not a stage name.
And it is indeed a real last name. Right.
Yes, I married into my brand.
I love it. That's great. That's really helpful. And I think that's important. I mean, I think if you just say to someone, well, tell me what your values are, you just get this like deer in headlights, it's too big of a question. Like, what? I don't know. And so to have something where people can really kind of dig in and prioritize. I mean, those card sort activities really are about prioritizing. There might be lots of different things that matter to you, but you can really kind of dial in on the top values that feel the most important for this stage of your life, this stage of your career, and what you're really looking at. And I know, you were saying like personality and values don't tend to change a lot over time. And I totally agree. I do think priorities can change a lot over time, right? So just in the example of you and I were talking before we hit record about caretaking responsibilities in families, right? So if I'm retired and my kids are out of my house, I might be much more interested in a career that allows me to travel and meet other people and, have a global reach. Whereas when I've got little kids at home, that's going to be something that I'm certainly not going to prioritize, even if I would like to at some point.
That's a great point, and exactly what you said is true. That different phase, when you're young, you might be willing to work long hours and you don't have a family, so you can do that more easily. But when you get older, I think values, when I said values don't change, I mean, if family's important to you, you're not going to suddenly think family is not important to you.
Totally.
But I like the way you worded that, because it is the prioritization that is the key. And over your lifetime, priorities will be different with your values. But the core is probably similar. So the life values probably don't change, but the work values, how you live in your work environment. And it is too big, because when you ask someone, like you said, even some people are like, oh yeah, I know my values. But then you ask them, well, what are your top three? That's when people get stuck. Was this more important than that? And you're right. The card sort is a great way to do that, because it forces you to not just say, oh, here's a few I value. It forces you to say into always valued, most valued, seldom valued, rarely valued, never valued. So it really forces you to break it down. And Can I say one other
getting
point?
out of your own head, right? Like getting out of your head and writing something down, having cards to look at, having cards to like move around I just think at least for me, it offers so much more clarity than just trying to think about it all inside my brain.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. Can I make one other point about values and alignment?
Yes, of course.
That a lot of times people, the general public, I'll say, don't really get the connection the way someone who's maybe a ACT therapist, trained therapist might. Mm-hmm. And I often say to people that really your values are really at the core of your career choices. And for an easy example is if you are eco-friendly, you're not going to take a job at a company that's been cited for pollution, right? And some people would say like, well, I'm just an accountant there. And they can kind of rationalize it for a year or two. But I always tell people that eventually that will catch up with you because the misalignment of the values is just so important that it will cause you to have stomach aches before you go to work. And you might not know why, and you might think it's a bad boss, or you might think it's something else. But usually when someone's really unhappy at a job, it usually is some value conflict, whether it's your values and the company's values or your values and your boss's values or the culture of the organization. Yeah. So it's really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so helpful to think about is I'm just really unhappy and it's this complaint and that complaint that if you really look at how does all of this, even if it's that more global culture or climate, how does that align with your values as a person? And that may be what's kind of underlying a lot of the dissatisfaction. Okay, so let's move on to the I in Vines. V for values, I is for interests. How is interests different from values? And how can people start identifying what interests them?
Okay, so in terms of values versus interests, that's an interesting question. I would say that interests are more things that intrigue you, capture your attention, like you love animals, or you love books, or you love science fiction, or you love working with your hands. So I think in terms of interests, your interests will give insight into what jobs would be a good fit based on whether you like artistic things, or you like order, or you like influencing, whether you like helping people. So, and all of those things I mentioned are really some key facets of something called the Holland Code. And the Holland Code is designed to measure your interests. And the U.S. Department of Labor has a free tool called the ONET Interest Profiler. And we can share a link in the show notes. That's a free way to get at this information. I usually use the self-directed search, which is a paid assessment through PAR. And it doesn't matter how you get it. There's a zillion versions of the Holland Code, free or paid.
And you even have a lot of helpful categories in the book. And in the book, you give loads of resources for where to find more.
I do. There's multiple. The Holland Code is probably the most widespread career framework and used very often. And so,
okay. And what's the PAR? You said something about the PAR. What does that stand for?
Psychological assessment resources. I think it's a very, it's a clinical they only sell assessments.
Okay.
And most of them are pretty clinical. Like many of them I can't actually use because I'm not qualified to use them, but they do, they have the rights to the self-directed search, which was created by John Holland.
Okay. And is interests different? Like I know the Myers-Briggs is one of those like personality tests that often come up during a career assessment. Is something like that, does that fall under interest, or is that more in the N, natural dispositions of the Vines?
Correct. That falls under natural disposition and is distinctly different than the interest. I mean, the interest would be more like, I like going to museums, I appreciate art, I appreciate music, whereas your natural disposition or Myers-Briggs might be more telling you that you like quiet time alone, to listen to the music and you appreciate the art. But it's it is different, I would say, distinctly, the interests and the personality.
Well, I think it was in your book that I filled out or answered some of the questions to look at that Myers-Briggs profile.
What'd you find?
And
I'm curious.
Well, the last time I took it was in 1998. Okay. And I was really surprised to find, so it was a long time ago, that I had the exact same profile. And I feel like I have changed and grown in many different ways as a person in that period of time. But those natural dispositions, right? Those like real, and I know that the Myers-Briggs can be controversial and, it is not without its criticism. We'll just go ahead and say that. But I was really interested to see. So I think it was ENFP. And that's what it was when I took it way back when. So I just thought that was really kind of interesting.
That is funny. And I guess a little surprising, but maybe not so surprising, because the other thing about the Myers-Briggs is it's the strength of the preference, right? So you can be a really strong E or a really slight E, and maybe in 1998 you were a slight E and now you're a really strong E. So I think that the letters have a little bit more depth. And I do also acknowledge that there are very controversial perspectives of the Myers-Briggs. You seem to either love it or hate it. I happen to be a lover of it. Even if you take it with sort of just a grain of salt, which all of these assessments, I really do caution people to not take them too seriously, because sometimes just because you answered it a certain way, it might come out a certain way, which is why when I meet with a client, we validate it. I don't just say, oh, you're an EFP. Okay, let's move on. Like, we'll just accept you're an ENFP. I would go through it and ask you some questions, and we would validate that. And we would talk about strength of preference. But ultimately, I think it's helpful, because if you're a really strong introvert, you're not going to be happy in a job where you have contact with 500 people a day. I mean, that's kind of just common sense to me.
Let's back up for a second, because I'm realizing not everyone listening will know what a Myers-Briggs is or what ENFP stands for. So can you kind of like snapshot quickly? That was my fault that I just jumped on into this lingo. We try not to be too lingo-y on the podcast. So what is the Myers-Briggs? And then just super briefly, like, what are those four categories, if you will, that it kind of puts people into? Sure.
So the Myers-Briggs has four dichotomies. And the first dichotomy is extroversion or introversion. And I think people are most familiar with that. And at a very primitive level, if you're an extrovert, you get energy from being around people. And if you're an introvert, people drain you. I mean, that's I'm trying to put it pretty simply. Sensing and intuitive, which is the S and the N, is what those are called, that dichotomy. Sensing is a bit more, you like to be in the present and the here and the now, and you like the facts and the details. Someone who's more intuitive is very future forward thinking, sees systems, big pictures, is more imaginative. Sometimes I joke that if you're in a meeting, the people coming up with all these great, crazy new ideas are the N's, and all the people who are the S's are saying, okay, whose budget is coming out of, what datas have to be done by, who's going to be assigned to it. So that kind of gives you a visual picture of the difference between the S and the N. And then the T and the F is feeling versus thinking. And I would summarize that by saying people who are strong on T make decisions with their head, logically. And people who are strong preference for F make values-based decisions with their heart. And then the last dichotomy is P and J. And the words are perceiving and judging, but it doesn't mean that if you're a J, you're a judgmental person. All the words are a little, you can't get too hung up on the labels, if you will. But it's really a matter of planfulness and how you show yourself to the world. So the J is, I'm a very strong J. I pride myself on being organized. That's actually my superpower, I would say. I like structure. I like to know what's going to happen in the next day and the next week. And I wouldn't do well in a job where I had to go to a different office every day and needed, 2 different file cabinets, things like that. Whereas P, someone who's more perceiving, is much more flexible, actually psychologically flexible, you would say, and can be more spontaneous and doesn't get as bent out of shape when the plan changes, types of things. So your Ps are like great firefighters and emergency responders and pilots and people that, their job depends on them being able to adapt in the moment, even in really crisis situations.
Yeah. Okay. So that's great. Thank you for walking us through that. That was really helpful. And as you were saying that, I'm thinking, I need to have my husband take this because I am almost positive he would be the exact opposite. So if I'm ENFP, he'd be an ISTJ.
Yes, my husband is the exact opposite. I'm an ESFJ and he is an INTP. It's makes for interesting planning discussions.
Well, we always talk about how we complement each other well, like where like you were saying in meetings, that you can't have just big ideas people. You have to have the logical facts people that also talk about the budget and this and that. And so, you hope that in a marriage, you complement each other in that way too.
You do. And I always have a funny story with my husband. We've been married 30 years and it was probably like 20 years into the marriage where he finally said to me, can we just have one weekend where nothing's planned in a month, which was funny, but very real. And I said, sure, that's a very reasonable request. Totally. And, that helped a lot. That helped a lot. Yeah. But it could be, you could fill in husband for boss, right? You have a very planful boss or you have a very unplanful boss and how that affects you as a worker. It's real.
Right. So can you think of an example how this could help someone if a job fits the description of their natural disposition versus how a mismatch could be problematic?
Sure. And I might try to address it individually by each individual dichotomy because it's a little hard to do all four at once. I already mentioned the strong introvert wouldn't do well in a public, a setting with high public contact. Where on the opposite end, an strong extrovert would not be happy sitting locked in a room alone for 8 hours a day. So that's the E and the I, which I think most people get that. But the other letters are a little less obvious, I guess. The S and the N, an S, someone who's strong preference for S, the sensing, would be really good in a job that involves detail orientation, like event management or payroll or something where you have to be precise. Like there's, things have to get done and things like administrators, organizers, that's where your S's might come in. And then the N's are the great idea people. So when you're, someone who's on an innovation team or product idea team, that's where your N's really thrive. And you made a good point. You don't want any one team to be made up of all the same type of personality. That's, I think, clear. But a good mix will give you different perspectives. With the T and the F, T's do very well, strong T's in jobs that require logic and black and white thinking. So your judges, your lawyers, your attorneys, your accountants, your programmers, they will do well in T-type jobs. F for feeling, you are going to find people who have a strong preference for F will do better in jobs like psychology, sociologist, career counselor, coach, mentor, motivator, cheerleader, teacher. Those are all good matches for people who are strong in that preference.
Right.
And then the PJ, we sort of alluded to that earlier as well. So the J's are really good, like project managers. And if you're an SJ, which you can get into, David Kiersey did work where he has come up with only 4 types, whereas the Myers-Briggs comes up with 16. So SJ is a Kiersey type. And that, to me, the SJs are like the Uber organizers because they have all that detail aspect of the S. They want to know when, where, how, and they've got the very strong J preference for being structured and routine and organized. So the P's would be, as I mentioned earlier, good in jobs that require spontaneity, where things change all the time and you have to be adaptable, like maybe logistics or shipping or something where a price fluctuates, like gas prices, or, something where like every day, like people in the airline industry, like flights get changed all the time, and or luggage has to get moved. Yeah. So that hopefully that gives you a little sense of answering that question.
Definitely. Okay. Yeah, that's great. And I think often when people actually take these structured assessments, like you said, there's so many of these available online, and some you have to pay for, but others are free. And, you often end up getting like a profile at the end that not only will describe what these natural dispositions are, but don't they often also give kind of a list of career types or jobs that do tend to be better or worse fits for people who fit these profiles?
They do. However, I find of all the assessments out there, the Myers-Briggs is the weakest in terms of giving you a list of occupations that would be a good fit. I mean, there are some lists out there, but most of them aren't comprehensive. There's a book called Do What You Are by Barbara Teeger and Paul Teeger, I think. And that goes into really involved description of what jobs, but it's kind of more of an academic book. And I'm not sure that, I had a hard time reading it just because it was so much information. It was good information. So it's hard to find that list. And there are some places, and you're right, they usually tell you, you're an ESFJ, and here's some famous people who are ESFJs, and here's some common types, and here's some careers that this type, does well in. But I haven't really found a great list. Whereas when you take an assessment like the ONET Interest Profiler, it literally gives you a list of job titles that are a fit. And then you can use that list to start narrowing down what does interest you, what doesn't interest you. I will mention 16personalities.com, which I'll share the URL with you, is one assessment that you get a Myers-Briggs type, and it's a reputable site, and it's free. So that's one way.
Is it 16 personalities, or is it 16 spelled out personalities?
It's the number, 16personalities.com.
The number, so 16personalities.com. And we'll put it in the show notes, but for anybody who's taking notes now, they'll know.
Yeah, so that's a good one. The one in my book is a very informal version. So I think you might want to take the 16 personalities, and I'd be curious to see if it still comes out,
If it still comes out. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think, for anyone who's already kind of done this work on their own, if you're still feeling stuck, that is what career coaches are for. So that's exactly what you do. If somebody has read a book or they've taken a thing online and they're still just feeling like, I need someone to really help me figure this out in a more detailed way, that's exactly what you do. Like you would walk someone through these different, through the vines, through the ASTER career model to kind of, just like reading a self-help book might not get you exactly where you need to be in terms of your emotional well-being, in which case you might need a psychotherapist to help you kind of dig deeper than what the book allows you to do. Exactly.
That's exactly right. And I wrote the book because I do believe that many people can be helped by just reading the book. Some people, it's very straightforward. When you look at their vines, it's, like a beacon of light shining in your face that you can't ignore, Other people, it's not as clear. And sometimes that's because of where they are in their life. Sometimes that's because they have many interests and their challenge is, what am I going to focus on next? So there's different reasons. There's definitely no shame if you can't figure it out on your own. It's not, like I said, a certain percentage of the population can read a book about accounting and do their taxes, right? It's kind of the same thing, but your situation might be different where you have to talk to an accountant because there's different nuances in your situation. So yes, I hope that people can read the book and get the help they need, but sometimes people will need more of a helping hand. And if you don't mind, I just want to mention, I think it's chapter 7, pulling everything together. I do make some distinctions between the type of professionals who can help you, because a lot of people don't understand the difference. Most people, I would say, know what a therapist is, what a therapist does. Most people associate the word therapist with psychotherapist, with counselor. And, those are people, their professions are regulated by state. It's very heavily regulated. And it should be easy to find a reputable person because they're, hopefully people get knocked out of the profession if they're unethical and not doing things well. So that's counselors, therapists. But then a career counselor, it's a little murky. So when I lived in Maryland, I could call myself a career counselor because I have a master's in applied psychology. And in Maryland, if you have a master's in any type of psychology, you can call yourself a career counselor. But more and more recent years, I've moved to Georgia, and plus I see clients in other locations. And so I've had to change my title to career coach because I don't want to do anything unethical, right? I'm very conscious of ethics. And I don't want to mislead anyone. And I want to follow the rules. I'm a J. I'm a rule follower. So
there's that J again.
Yep. So I value integrity, right? So I changed my title to career coach for that exact reason. So different states might recognize career counselors or not. In some states like North Carolina, Ohio, you have to be a licensed therapist to call yourself even a career counselor. And then you have career coaches, and coaches of any sort, whether it's career, life coach, weight coach, are not regulated at all. So, there's organizations that have codes of ethics and things like that. But if you're not a member of that organization, you are not held to that ethical standard in reality. So career coaches, I think it gets a little murkier, and you have to do a little bit more research and make sure the person has the right credentials for what you need help with. Because you could have career coaches who specialize in federal jobs, right? Or being a veteran or being a mom. I mean, there's so many specialties within career coaching.
Yeah. And like you said, there are some people that, pay dues to belong to a professional association, who have gone the extra mile to get certifications, but they don't have to. Like, absolutely anyone can call themselves a life coach and hang a shingle and say, oh yeah, I do this. And so for consumers to be able to look and see, do you belong to a professional association? Have you gotten accreditation and training as a coach? And do you specialize in the specific area that I'm looking for help for? And those coaches should know that if you call them and say, oh, I've just been so depressed and I really can't get off my butt to go get a new job, that they should really be evaluating whether coaching is appropriate or whether you need, kind of a higher level of mental health care, that they understand the differences between coaching and counseling or psychotherapy, and that they're not crossing that line into psychotherapy when they should be referring to a therapist.
Yeah, that's critical. And my hope is that people do the right thing there, but there's no one regulating that. So that's why, as a consumer, you really have to be careful. Buyer beware. Exactly.
And just be more aware. And there's so many incredible coaches out there. And in our acceptance and commitment therapy community, it's really technically contextual behavioral science. We have a professional association, and we have many, many coaches that all do acceptance and commitment training. So it's not psychotherapy, but it's ACT, but it's in the coaching world rather than in the therapy world. And many of those coaches are also psychologists or therapists, and, talk to their clients about what the lines and the differences are, and make sure that that's clear. Yeah.
I would say that for the consumer, that no matter who you're working with, they should be able to give you something in writing. Like I do an informed consent, even though I'm not a therapist. And it says right there, here's my credentials. If you present some issues that seem beyond my expertise, I will refer you to a therapist or someone who's more appropriate. And really, everyone should go into a coaching relationship knowing, I think, what the boundaries are of that relationship.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about exceptional qualities. This is the E in Vines. So I want to talk about how do we know what these are? And specifically what I was thinking about is, I work with a lot of clients who I suspect would come up blank here, right? If I were like, what are your exceptional qualities? I think many of them, and just as human beings, not because they're psychotherapy clients, but just as human beings, I think we're really good at talking about our weaknesses and not so good at talking about our strengths. And certainly, I think I'd have a hard time. Well, let me tell you about all of my exceptional qualities, Paula. So how do you get people to be able to like get beyond that. I don't know what you even call that. It's almost like people feel vulnerable saying out, maybe especially women. We've really been trained that we must be humble, and it doesn't feel very humble to say what our exceptional qualities are. So is there a way that you work with that?
Yeah, there are a few ways that I work with it. And I will just begin by acknowledging the truth that you're expressing, which is that most women, I'm going to just say it because in my experience this has been true, are not comfortable bragging. That's
right.
Just the way it is. Most men, and again, I'm totally generalizing, but in general, most men don't really have a problem bragging, especially in the right context. Women, it almost doesn't matter the context. Even in an interview, when that's what you have to do is brag to get the job, many women will choose to not brag and therefore don't get the job. So I think that there's a lot of different reasons. Certainly there's so much culturization for women about being humble, being quiet, and your show has talked about that so much that I don't want to dwell on that because I feel like people get that if they're a regular listener. But the one thing I will say is that beyond all the cultural influences, I think most people miss their superpower because they're so good at it. They kind of think everyone's that good at it. And that's a really basic thing, but I think it's very true. And myself included, it wasn't until my mid 40s, I'd say, that I claimed, okay, I am an organized person. I am more organized than most people. Doesn't mean I'm perfect. Doesn't mean I don't, I'm not ever disorganized. But if things are too disorganized for too long, I will get very antsy. And order will have to happen for me to move forward.
Do you think, did that come from feedback? Because I get a lot of feedback that I'm organized and I'm like, really? I don't think of myself as being organized. And it's really taken a lot of feedback, or people will tell me I'm articulate, or what's the other one? Oh, even like that I'm a good public speaker. And these were all things that I'm like, really? I never saw myself that way. And it wasn't until I heard it like many times over. So same as you, I was probably like really middle-aged before I was like, okay, maybe this is true that these are exceptional qualities that I have, but it didn't come from inside. It came from outside. I mean, maybe that's one of the ways to get people to think about it. What have you been told many times by other people when they give you positive feedback? Is that a good way to think about what some of your superpowers or exceptional qualities might be?
Yes, that is a very good way, with a caveat from Tara Moore that like you don't have to listen to all feedback. So I will just put that little caveat. You might have one really mean boss that gives you really bad feedback and they take it to heart. And so that's not the best way to find your superpower. But of course, there are assessments, and I'll mention one in a minute. But I would say that, yes, it's usually from getting feedback. And for me, it was all the people who ask me to organize things, asking me to organize their closet, asking me to organize an event, asking me, so that is something that you might want to think about. There are a few questions from the book that try to pull this out. And that is one of them. What do people ask you for help with on a regular basis? Mm-hmm. And it's very simple, but it's a simple idea. But because people, again, are good at it, they don't realize that everyone is not as good at that. And they basically ignore it, or they just don't shed light on it, or they don't claim it. But also feedback. What feedback have you gotten over the years? If you look at old employee reviews, if you've been in an organization that has formal employee reviews, if you look back over the past 5 years, what are the words that keep coming up? She's so reliable. She's so friendly. You're going to see, I worked at the World Bank as a career advisor consultant, and people would give me the past 10 years of their reviews before a meeting. And I would just go through it with a highlighter, and it was so clear, right? Year after year, person after person, you definitely see themes if you do a review of feedback. You can also think about, what do you receive praise for a lot? What comes easy to you?
Right. Because we like to do things that we feel like we're good at.
Exactly.
Right. I'm going to volunteer to do the stuff I feel competent at. Yeah.
Exactly. So those are some ways, just asking some pointed questions. You can get feedback. There's one assessment it used to be through William Arruda. It was called the 360 Reach. or Reach 360. Now it's through Career Blast, and now it's not free, but it's basically a tool where, and I'll just write this down so I can share the link. It's a survey that gets sent out to people you know. You decide who it's getting sent to, and it's anonymous, so you don't get to see Jill said this about you. And some of it's direct questions, and some of it is free form. They can put comments. So that's a really formal way to get feedback outside of work and a useful tool. Again, themes emerge. And standout.com is an assessment by Marcus Buckingham, who created the Strengths Finder. And he has an assessment called Standout, and he made it available during COVID. And as far as I know, it's still free on his website. I just checked last month. And so that's a way where you answer formal questions, and then it gives you your top 2 out of 9 characteristics.
Yeah. Now that we're talking about this, I didn't even think of this when I was reading the book, but I have a really close friend who was working with a career coach at one point. And I just remembered her reaching out to me and 2 of our other good friends. And the question, so it was like what you're talking about, but it was more informal rather than like lots of pages of questions. And it was just like, when you think of me, what are the top 3 adjectives that come to mind that you think best describe me? Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't so much getting at strengths necessarily or exceptional qualities, but just sort of like qualities in general. And I think the coach used that feedback in, kind of figuring out like what a path forward for her would be.
Yes, that's another way that you can do it. It's a common way. You can informally ask 10 people, what are 3 words you would use to describe me? And then see if there's any overlap between those 10 people's 3 words.
Right. I really, really liked you. You had, I think, a different take on strengths and weaknesses. So about strengths, this is the beginning of the Embrace Your Exceptional Qualities chapter. Paula says, when speaking about strengths and weaknesses, there are generally 2 perspectives. One promotes trying to overcome your weaknesses. The other suggests that you build upon and focus on your strengths while also finding ways to compensate for your weaknesses, such as hiring someone to do that part of the work, delegating to others, etc. I believe in the latter approach. I'm not saying that we should never try to work on our weak areas, but I do believe that it's not worth your time and energy trying to mitigate a weakness. Your time is much better spent uncovering your strengths and finding ways to put them to use. And, my dad wrote a book. It's called Reflections of a Serial Entrepreneur, because he was a serial entrepreneur. And they were these little bite-sized chapters, and so many of the tips from the book really have stuck with me. And I thought of this when I read that in your book, which is, know what you're good at and focus on that, and hire other people who are good at the stuff you're not good at to do that, which is what you're saying in terms of delegating and that kind of thing. But I just loved that. Like, you don't have to work so hard on strengthening your weaknesses. Just focus on doing the things that you're good at, that you're strong at, and find a great team to fill in where needed. I love that.
Yes, I think that's really important for good career management. And I guess the other thing I will say, I think I mentioned this in the book, but any strength to an extreme can be a weakness in itself. So, right, every mountain has a dark side. So it's also
sometimes our best qualities are also our biggest.
Yes. So you do have to have some intentionality and mindfulness to know when those when you are in your strength, when your strength is turning to a weakness, when you're focusing too much on a weakness that isn't going to be easily corrected, and it's not worth the pain of correcting it. I mean, it's not hurting anyone. It's, it's not worth all that energy to try to make it go away, if you will.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about skills. So that's the last one in the Vines model. Mm-hmm. To what extent do you recommend brainstorming, like really thinking outside of the box and listing every skill, even if it doesn't seem like it's related to your professional domain, right? So like I'll get for example, my husband is an IT guy. We talked about him being the ISTJ, I think. But he also is like really good at coming up with metaphors. It's just this random superpower he has that, like, if he's trying to explain something to me that I don't understand, he'll be like, it's kind of like, and what's really ironic is I wrote a book about metaphors, but he's actually,
say, that's really handy.
Yeah, he's actually much better at coming up with metaphors than I am. So if you were working with him, would you have him list that? Because maybe you think like, actually metaphors are a really effective way to teach others who don't know. So is it useful if I'm good at playing the trumpet, but I don't do anything related to music in my career? Would I still write down one of my skills is that I play the trumpet?
So that's an interesting question. And I would say you could start that way, but that would be a much longer route to the end result. So
what would you do instead?
I would say, with values, that might be something more useful, like put all your values and then prioritize them. With skills, I would probably focus a little bit more on, I would definitely focus on transferable skills. Because if you're changing careers or you're trying to do any change in your career, whether it's slight or very drastic, you really have to focus on transferable skills. I would say there's 3 different types of skills. Job-specific skills, like a nurse being able to draw blood. That's a very job-specific skill. That's not really going to do you too much use outside of, say, the healthcare profession.
Right.
And then you have traits, and traits you could argue might be like being on time. You could say that's a skill, but it's also kind of a personal trait. And so when you look at your skills, you want to look at your traits, your job-related skills, but really you want to focus on the transferable skills because those are the things that are going to get you the traits. They're not going to change that much. You're not going to suddenly be always late, right?
Right.
And the job-related might not be transferable. So you want to focus on your transferable skills and the ones you enjoy the most. So if you think of your skill sets in 4 categories, you love them and you're great at them. You love them, but you're not that good at them. Those would be your developmental skills. You're good at them, but you hate them. Those are your burnout skills. And you don't really love them and you're not really that good at them. And that would be kind of like that weakness area where it's just don't bother. So
awesome.
You want to, so I would say make a list of the skills you love using and you're very good at, and then prioritize which of those you want to use in the next job.
Okay, great. Oh, that's so helpful. That's great.
Yeah. And with your husband being in an IT job, I mean, a lot of those are going to be very specific. Like I can program, right. I can network in a system, so for him, it might be like, I like solving problems. That would be the transferable skill. Or I like building systems.
Yeah. Not metaphors.
Metaphors is probably too micro. Yeah. But you could, teaching, right, could be a skill. And so, yeah, I think making metaphors as a skill is a little bit too micro to help your career.
Yeah.
But it's good to know about yourself, right? Because it could come in handy.
Sure, right.
If your wife is writing a book about metaphors.
Right. Okay, so now we have these lists. And we've got our values and our interests and our skills and our qualities and all of this. And I imagine that that could be something that starts to feel a little bit overwhelming. Like, what do I do with all this information now? So how do we translate this to ideas for actual jobs that we might pursue?
So you look for the themes. That's really it. And this is a simplified example, but let's just say someone values being healthy and being fit, being active. Their interests are exercise and athletics and sports, and their natural disposition is that they like being around people, and they're orderly and organized and factual and specific. And one of their exceptional strengths is teaching other people what to do. And they have a variety of skills like coordinating and teaching others could also be a skill and a strength. And someone like that, I think it would be not hard to brainstorm some ideas, right? So someone with that type of profile, if you will, it would be a no-brainer to at least consider a personal trainer, a gym teacher, someone in athletics, a coach, personal trainer, someone who works in a gym. So there's a lot of ideas you can generate just from looking at the themes. And then the other thing is that the themes, as what we're saying is that looking at all the different pieces of the vines, usually there's a theme. Usually there's some sort of guidepost. Now, here's the thing. I just listed 5 or 10 possible things, and none of them might interest the person. But the second part of the process, the seeking out information, is when they would go talk to a physical therapist, go talk to a personal trainer, research how much money, what's an annual income for those types of jobs. They're very different. Some of them you have to be very entrepreneurial. Some you might not like the work environment. Maybe you don't like sweating. I don't know. There could be other things about you that make those all not valid, but that's part of the process, is doing the assessments, getting the ideas, whether literally from lists from those assessments or brainstorming from what themes are popping up. It doesn't matter where you get the list, as long as it makes sense. And then you vet the list. And that's really the process.
Well, and I can say that this 100% happened for me when I went through and read the book. I mean, I know we're at the end of our time here, and all we got through was the A in the ASTER model. So people can pick up the book, to learn more, you give a lot of good ideas for how people can seek out information so that you're not just jumping into a job you think might be okay, but you're really doing your due diligence and having the best chance that you're going to move in a direction that's a great fit for you. And I want to be doing a lot more. Well, it's interesting because I want to be doing more public speaking. But I also want to start doing some more health coaching, specifically with bariatric surgery patients. And they feel like they're very different. And I was like, I don't know. Is this the right pivot given what my background is? And anyway, I went through all of these steps and themes definitely emerged. And for me, it wasn't so much I need to figure out what my next steps are. It was, am I doing the right thing? Kind of pivoting and moving into these new directions and walking through the steps. Like you said, sometimes there's this like glaring spotlight that sort of happens. And I just felt very like relieved and relaxed of like, okay, like this is right. I'm definitely moving in the right direction for what I see as my next career move. So thank you for writing such a helpful book. I recommend it. You do a good job of writing clearly, you make the concepts really clear, but not oversimplified. And it was pretty quick to like go through it, even though I feel like I did a lot of in-depth work, if that makes sense. So, and I say that because I think sometimes people feel overwhelmed. Like there's just so much that I have to think about. And, it feels like such a big deal to consider a job or career change. And I just felt like this was not difficult, not super time consuming, which surprised me, but incredibly clarifying. So I think for anyone who is, just not quite sure what their next steps are in their career, it's called The Purple Parachute, A Woman's Guide to Navigating the Winds of Career Change. And I know you work with a lot of women, but this book is absolutely appropriate for anyone, I think, who is navigating a career change, irrespective of gender. It was really, really quite helpful.
Thank you. I think I've gotten some other feedback about that as well, that even though all the stories at the end of each chapter are about real women, and that was one way I tried to try to tie in the female aspect. But I've gotten a lot of feedback recently about similar things to you're saying, where you could use the model for any big decision, like, should I move somewhere, or, should I retire? Because it kind of forces you to really think, where am I? What's going to make me happy? I mean, in that way, it's not
what matters to me. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very, when I was listening to a lot of the past podcasts, it was interesting to me how many themes that come up in your podcast also come up in career management, and the values-based decision is really where that comes in. So, just taking a moment to pause and really think about what you want and what's going to get you there. So I'm really happy and thankful that it helped you. I think for some people, it might be a little harder and take a little longer if they're not as clear. I think you're in a place in your career where you're very clear, you're enjoying what you're doing. And for some people, that does happen. We go through the whole process, and what they learn is, oh, right, I really like what I was doing.
I'm right where I'm meant to be. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in one case, it was slightly different. It was someone who was in sales, healthcare sales, in a very toxic environment, came to me thinking, I don't want to do sales anymore at all. And then going through the process, she realized, actually, I'm really good at selling and I really do enjoy it. I just don't want to do it in healthcare and in this toxic environment. She became a realtor, and she's doing great as a realtor. So sometimes it is a drastic difference that is needed, but sometimes it's a little tweak. And in your case, sometimes it's actually telling you you're right where you're meant to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, you already gave us a couple of your websites, but just to wrap up where people can find you, what's the best website if they want to learn more or order your book or even work with you?
Sure. The easiest way to find me is to go to paulabrand.com. And I don't even think you need the www, but let's just, to be clear, say www.paulabrand.com. And that's PaulaBrand, because a lot of people get the last name wrong. And I do have social media handles. They'll be on the website. When you get to the website, the menu on top, one says work with me. So that would give you ideas of how to work with me. And one says my book. And that's how you could order the book.
Terrific. We'll send people there. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was incredibly helpful. And I think our listeners definitely will get a lot out of this one. Thanks, Paula.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.